Welcome to this update for the S&P 500. Please remember this is for entertainment purposes only. Now, at the end of 2023, I put 6% of my portfolio into the S&P 500 with the intention of topping that up to 10% at the end of last year. I did a video entitled Trump Pump Scenarios, and in that video I concluded that it was worth topping up to 10% as I'd initially intended, because I was still fairly bullish on the US. It was the number one hydrocarbon exporter, the best companies in the world, low inflation, and Trump promised more capitalism and a modernized economy. However, there were a couple of bearish factors I outlined, one of which being transition risks. And in the last few weeks, there's been a tidal wave of apparently crazy actions by Trump. And so these transition risks are much larger than I'd thought. Pulling 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico seems absolutely crazy. And just look at what they're doing to their neighbors. When you look at the exports of Canada here and Mexico, you see most of their exports are to the US. So Trump really is crippling his neighbors. Then, of course, they're siding with Russia against Ukraine. And what a calamity that seems to be turning into. So last Monday, I exited my S&P 500 position entirely, only a 4% loss from the start of the year, and a fairly easy decision to make because the yield I was looking for on the S&P 500 was 16% a year. So obviously, measured up against all these apparent risks, it's just not worth the risk. The 16% yield just isn't worth that risk. And so I'm very happy to be sat on the sidelines now in money market funds. So that actually completes my kind of investment angle there. But it's definitely worth having a good look at what's going on, because this is going to set the investment environment in the coming decades, depending on how successful the Republicans are with Agenda 47. So, like I said, at first sight, it looks like an absolute bull in the china shop. Trump shut down the borders. He's imposed massive tariffs, including 25% on Canada and Mexico. There's the Doge activity, and then there's siding with Russia. Now, at first sight, this actually does look completely crazy. But by reading into it, I found that there is actually method to the madness. So by shutting down the borders and imposing these tariffs, Trump's actually halting free trade to switch from the globalist economy to economic nationalism. And to understand that, you've actually got to take a right step back. And in fact, I found myself going back to my GCSE level geography lessons when we learn about how different economies have primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. And you find that poor countries tend to be mostly primary sector and rich countries tertiary sector. So primary sectors just digging raw materials out of the ground or growing crops and exporting them. The secondary sector is manufacturing, and then the tertiary sector, that's the service sector. And there's actually also now a quaternary sector which covers all the kind of FANG stocks and things like that. So traditionally you'd have like a pyramid for the poor countries, and then when you move to the rich countries you get a inverted pyramid where it's mostly tertiary sector. How this works, the new Keynesian economics based globalist economy that we currently have, you still have actually the kind of pyramid overall, and the percentage here are the percentage composition for the US, but it's just that you import the commodities of poor countries, And rather than because you've got the high cost of labor in rich countries relative to poor countries, you outsource the labor by outsourcing the manufacturing, and that's the whole point of what low tariffs and globalist economics is all about, is outsourcing the manufacturing to countries where the cost of labor is cheap. You could say slave labor and child labor, but that's what the current globalist economy is based on. However, in order to then grow the service sector, and also the demographic trends kind of fit into this as well, where we have nobody having babies in wealthy countries. You basically, for decades, the West has been using human trafficking or immigration to acquire cheap labor. And when you look at the stock market ever since the 80s here, or if you look at M2 money supply, where we have an exponential trend upwards, or you look at gross domestic product in the US, which again you have this exponential trend upwards, you can see that the wealthy nations have done very well from this globalist new Keynesian economics over many decades. And in particularly old people, particularly the baby boomers, have got extremely rich through their pensions out of this policy. However, it has come with increasing national debt, and there is the question of how sustainable it is. Having extrapolated out these charts myself, I actually think it's sustainable for quite a few more decades. But surely you will get to a point where the steepness of these curves become a mathematical impossibility to continue, particularly as the interest on the government debt becomes unmanageable. Eventually, the US would go bankrupt. It's been able to enjoy its luxurious government spending and defense spending whilst keeping to its government mandates of 2% GDP growth, low inflation, low unemployment, and an artificially strong US dollar. It's been able to get away with huge government debt, which is currently 118% of GDP when I last measured it, and a fiscal deficit of 6% of GDP per year when I last measured it. It's been able to get away with this because of deflationary forces. The key ones being the US dollar being the global reserve currency, and which makes it artificially strong, and also these forces of globalization, which mean that you pare back inflation by importing lots of cheap goods from China using slave labor. So the first two things which Trump has done, shutting down the borders and imposing massive tariffs on Canada and Mexico, these are designed to attack these two key tenets of globalism. He shut down the borders, so this puts a stop to all the human trafficking, and he's whacked massive tariffs on his main trading partners, which is going to stop the outsourcing of manufacturing and forces people to manufacture within the US instead. And so these two actions here, there is method to the madness, and they are clearly designed to force the US and then maybe the world economy away from globalism and into a nationalist economics model, which will, however, I believe, require AI bots and robotics to replace the cheap imported labor and the cheap outsourced manufacturing. An interesting subplot is that what you should what you may find is more advanced manufacturing within the US, and but low tech manufacturing, things like say ball bearings or low tech circuitry and things, that will still be outsourced, but you'll have lots of other countries competing with each other to sell you the same low-tech manufactured goods. So you actually get commodity prices, and you're essentially manufacturing the highest, most profit stuff yourself. AI robots being a good example of that. Whereas low-tech manufacturing goods, you will still be importing, but at commodity prices. So in terms of the Doge, obviously that's amazing, and I'd love to see that happening in the UK. And by by reducing all of the waste in government, although that will lower GDP growth, it will to some extent offset the inflation that will be on its way from the tariffs. But then the siding with Russia, I'm not sure if this is Trump being stupid. I mean, as a European, I myself feel betrayed by Trump over this. But it's clear that we're going to be entering a multipolar world. Obviously, that's the shift from globalism to economic nationalism is going to create this multipolar world. That's all part of it. But I'm not sure whether the deal here is that the US is going to keep NATO going, but it's just that he wants the Europe to deal with Russia, whereas the US deals with China, or if it's just every man for himself, and the US is going to abandon Taiwan. Now, if that happens, I do worry. What does that mean for the US dollar? Because, I do wonder, by abandoning its allies, has Trump taken for granted the fact that everyone's buying US dollar treasuries? And could this backfire? Could this cowardice over Ukraine backfire and lead to a US some kind of US dollar collapse, because no one needs to pay protection money anymore by loading up on US treasuries? One interesting thing is, where's the UK going to stand in all this? Is the UK going to ally with the US or with the EU? So finally, Trump is enacting his Agenda 47 policies, but in order to achieve their goals of economic nationalism, a lot has to happen. Vance is going to have to be elected twice to properly enact all the policies that are going to be needed in order to switch the world from a globalist economy to a nationalist economy. They've achieved the border thing, that was easy, but they're going to have to be successful in completing the tariff reforms in order to cut off that aspect of globalism. They're going to have to they're going to have to build the factories in the US to replace the factories where the work's currently being outsourced to. The AI bots is going to have to be phased in within 10 years in order for it to work, because by then the loss of all the cheap labor imported from abroad, it just will not work unless this cheap labor is replaced with AI bots. And in all this time, you're going to have GDP growth, low unemployment, low inflation, and the US dollar's got to stand up. Because if Vance doesn't get elected in any of the next two elections, then we'll see a return to globalism. So I'm definitely glad to be out of the S&P 500, and I've got quite some time before I need to start considering whether I want to play the roller coaster or not. But it turns out from reading into things, there is method to the madness. I should say this is my first draft, my first conceptualization about what's going on. So bear that in mind, and over the next few years, I'll be kind of refining my model here. But that's my interpretation about what's been going on. There is method to the madness, but it's going to be a horrible time to invest over the next few years, because what the Trump presidency is attempting really is a fundamental change to the world economic system. I do videos like this one just for fun as a hobby. It's for entertainment purposes only. Always consult a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decision.